Hey everyone, Temporal here, and it is time to do some power rankings. This is now the end of the Swiss bracket for Homecoming Collegiate, so the first round, of course, or the first 5 rounds, however you want to think of it, 10 rounds even, of the Activision Blizzard Homecoming tournament here. And we have the top 32 teams. For those that are curious, you can see them right here. This is what they did in terms of where they went. That's great. But what we're actually going to look at is we're going to compare those top 32, which I've overlaid here, to our power rankings. And I've gone ahead and done power rankings based on the matchups, based primarily on the matchups, how they've done against each other, little bit of legacy strength, scrim strength in there when we had nothing else, but we're relatively deep into this first season here, and we do now have this level where we can go, hey, we know what we're looking at. So that's great. This is what I've put up there. Not going to make you guys watch the whole thing through to see it if this is just what you're after. Of my rankings are the order that the schools are actually in on this tier list from left to right. And then the rankings that I've written on top here are the rankings that we've come up with, or not we've come up with, but the Game Battles has done through their 10 rounds, but really 5 special rounds of Swiss play there. So that's what they had. I'm actually going to start by covering the big differences, the big important things that have happened in this last week or so of play, or since our last tier list 2 weeks ago, which I did link in the description below. So Redbirds are still king, no big thing there. That's not a that went about as we expected. This is our first big important matchup right here. We had this match. I actually reviewed this match earlier on stream on this channel if you guys want to check it out. But Dallas surprised everyone. Most people would have put Dallas as, yes, a top 6 team, yes, one of the big real players, but they would have probably put them in their 5 or 6 spot for teams, not in the 2 spot, certainly. Northwood was sort of the undisputed number 2 team, and Dallas went ahead and beat them. So that's certainly a big stir up, jumping from what most people would have considered the 5 or 6 seed to the number 2 spot here. So good on them. Then we have Northwood. They do get to retain still being in this monster tier, as we're going to call it here, as they do have significant wins against the other teams in a here, except for Dallas. And, well, if we actually pull up exactly what they have, Northwood do in fact still have wins previously against Dallas, a couple times against Maryville, Harrisburg, Northeastern, Bay State, and then a loss to Redbirds elsewhere and a loss to Dallas more recently than their win here. So that we're looking at for this. So we move into the second tier. Maryville doesn't have any reason to win. This was another upset of sorts. Harrisburg had been shown up. Harrisburg had been beaten up on a bit at QFest, which was a LAN earlier this season, but they did go ahead and go the whole way. We had a first map in the Harrisburg versus Bay State went to Harrisburg. Then we had a draw on map 2. Then we went on to map 3 and a flip to Bay State. And then we had our fourth map, which did go for Harrisburg. So Harrisburg gets to flip things up there and move ahead of Bay State as they have the more recent win. Yes, I did hear about Alarm Mentos. That's wild, and I'm sorry to hear it, but I'm going to continue with this for now. Then we move on to our Dark Horses tier. So we've covered the big 6 teams, the big teams that maybe these guys could win it all. These are the teams that could do some damage, but it would really be surprising if they actually won. I mean, Dark Horse, they could do it, but them taking someone out in this tier list, not a big problem at all. Maybe a lift, but not like wild. It's something that they would be expected to be able to do. And what we've done here is we've got UC Irvine. UC Irvine had this spot before as the leader in the Dark Horse bracket. They didn't have much propping that up previously, other than they had, how do I want to put this, other than the fact that Legacy put them there. They'd, made wins against monster type teams in the past. Well, now they've got a little bit more to prop them up. They did beat Penn State down here. That's not that impressive. The Penn State turned out a little stronger than I thought they were going to in terms of how they did overall. They also got wins against UC Santa Cruz as well as wins against Ohio State. So, okay, that's enough. They didn't beat people here, which is what we would have liked to see to really prop this up, but this isn't totally unearned, unpropped. There's at least something to reinforce them being here now, and they didn't take any losses along the way that would cause us to move them down. And their one loss is going to be to Harrisburg, who is up here in the tier above them. Not a big deal that that happened. Okay, that makes sense. We can keep them here. No need to move them. Waldorf is in much the same boat. They did finish 8-2, and they went ahead and finished 8-2 with their losses being to what was it, Bay State and Harrisburg, I believe. Bay State obviously has played against Waldorf 3 times this season. They first beat them 3-0, then lost 3-2 the next day, then beat them again later this season. So Waldorf is going to be down here, Bay State up here. I think if they went again, we would continue to see this go Bay State's way, but we don't necessarily know that. We'll see what happens. The most recent win is for Bay State, though, as well as having 2 of the 3 wins for Bay State. So Waldorf does sit here. They didn't really then go beat anyone particularly impressive. They have wins over University of Washington. That's good. They have wins over Northeastern from quite a bit ago, the same tournament where they beat Bay State there. They beat Lords in Nace. So that's fine, but this was true at their last power ranking as well. In the last 2 weeks, they haven't really went and gotten any super impressive wins. In fact, they did at a LAN go get second place to a team that we might not have expected them to. So this might look a little bit vulnerable. We will see. Then we move on to Boise, and this is a pretty big move. It's not like a huge move, I should say. I'd say this is important. So what happened here, before we had Boise at the top of this tier, we had Bellevue sort of here at the end of this tier, and we had the Waterloo Warriors right behind Boise. Excuse me, not right behind Boise, right behind Bellevue. And Bellevue went ahead and got themselves... Who was it? Let me rephrase that. That's great, but what happened, the important matchup, was the Warriors here actually beat Miami, Ohio. And Miami, Ohio used to be the back end of this tier up here. So we've gone ahead and said, hey, this springs Bellevue forward. We're going to spring Bellevue forward because the Warriors who Bellevue has recently beat, or who Bellevue has beaten, beat Miami, Ohio. Miami, Ohio was already sitting in a tier above when they had a loss to Lords, so it was now time to drag them down. And what was holding them up was their win over Utah. Utah is mostly just holding up there over Legacy, and Utah, unfortunately, has not, unlike Irvine, picked up any really that meaningful wins on the way here. If we look at Utah in terms of who they beat CU Boulder, and we can take a look at that. Okay, that's something. They beat, let me just pull this up one more time. Sorry, guys. They beat Akron, who 7-3 team fell off. UCLA, who's going to be a a relatively low-ranked team here, but hey, it's something. But if you look at this, that's another team that, okay, they got it, but they just barely got in right at the cutoff there. And then we're going to see that they beat Hurricanes, another not real meaningful school. And their loss is, of course, to Miami, Ohio here. So 9-1, that's strong. Don't get me wrong, but we care a lot more about the matchups than we do the records. And this is telling us it's time for a bit of adjustment here. So Bellevue moves up to here. They get sort of pushed up here by Waterloo, sliding up over here ahead of Miami. Boise is going to stay ahead of Bellevue, and the reason Boise stays ahead of Bellevue is because they played against a school that wouldn't qualify St. Thomas for most collegiate play. Most collegiate play would say that's a roster that doesn't work. They've played in a LAN. I want to say they've played in an all-star brawl. And we do know from a LAN that both of these schools played at that Boise beat St. Thomas and St. Thomas beat Bellevue. So that's we're using that as our proxy for their strength difference of what puts them where. But if Bellevue moves up here, Boise is going to move up here until different wins and losses change that. And then we moved Miami, Ohio, and Utah down to here again, based on the loss to Waterloo and the loss to Lords that previously happened for Miami, Ohio. Nothing really changed here. Then we get onto this. Utah, again, is just sort of floating here. We could, in theory, put Utah quite a bit lower. We can't really put them higher without Miami, Ohio going higher, but we're not really willing to move them further down at this point, in part based on legacy, in part based on, well, their wins aren't impressive, but they haven't lost to anyone that they really shouldn't have lost to either. So they're going to stay here. Ohio State isn't really too terribly linked to other people either here. They've got their win against Pennsylvania State. They've got their win against Akron, who's fallen off. They've got their win against UCLA. Um, they've got a loss to Waterloo and to Irvine. So that's not wild. They're supposed to lose to Irvine. They lost to Waterloo. They're back here behind that. Nothing too wild there. Sounds pretty similar to Utah. We've got them here for now, kind of floating. Nowhere else really to put them. Then we're going to go ahead and move on to Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz didn't change anything too much since the last time here. They've beat SCAD, they've beat Rit Orange, they've beat Akron, and SCAD is going to be the right next team, so that makes sense. We'll go ahead with it. SCAD has lots of meaningful matches. They obviously have the loss to the Banana Slugs here. They've got the win against Valkyries. They've got the win against UW, and they've got the win against UNT. So that makes sense for them to be here. We have to just guess our order effectively between these two schools, but we're going to do so. Nothing too wild here. We're going to put Valkyries next and UW after that. These haven't really changed since previous weeks, so we'll leave them. Then we move down to good teams. Previously, I didn't go super in depth on what I'm going to consider our good teams territory, and there's more teams I could put in here. There's actually teams that if I went with like true tier list ranking style or power ranking style and didn't go, oh, I care at all about what the homecoming tournament here says, like if I didn't care about these rankings at all, I could put different teams in here that probably are, based on what we've seen, stronger than the 32 that made it. There's a couple that would justify that, just based on some of these losses, wins, matchups, that sort of thing. But we're not going to worry about it too much. We're going to limit what we're interested in here to the 32 teams that made it, because I think at this point in the season, that's what most people care about. You heard Jayhawk Esports, someone took Koth off of Lords. Oh, cool. Okay, good to know. I don't doubt that. I mean, it happens. Like any kind of, well, that's not too well. Owen Nace, nice. Cool. So let's continue on through here, and that can absolutely happen. Like it's great to do that, to go, hey, let's get another team in here mixed up, go try to take something else out, but at this moment, at this point in time, most of our focus is going to be on homecoming. We absolutely care about the collegiate scene in general, and we will continue to move teams back on here that make sense. But for this moment in time, we're going to continue through here, and I've limited it to the 32 teams that made it, and we're going to sort of put our differences versus the differences that are in the seeding that's been done by Game Battles based on the matches and their black magic tiebreaker calculations. So we've got Winthrop here. We moved Winthrop and UNT. We moved Winthrop up. That's not too wild. Winthrop has wins against OU Crimson, Hawaii Manoa, KSU Black, losses to Waterloo, Converse, Bay State. So those losses, we'd expect them to take those losses. The wins against OU Crimson, Hawaii Manoa, KSU Black, we know what the level of those teams are. They were sort of in the middle of it. We've seen where they did, how their rankings were. That makes sense. Those are reasonably good teams to put Winthrop at the top of this good teams category. UNT, on the other hand, they've got losses to Northeastern, two of them this season, a loss to SCAD, but ultimately they don't have any super meaningful wins. We're going to go ahead and put them here. We could put them lower. There's some schools in here that do have slightly more interesting wins, but not actually too much. Once we get to about here-ish, we're going to discover that things start getting really messy, and they do get messy. Penn State surprised me, did a bit better than I expected. They beat Rutgers. Now, Rutgers is a 6-4 team, but you'll find that that's somewhat meaningful later because Rutgers also beats Illinois Orange, if memory serves. So, yeah. Little bit weird. Illinois Orange has beaten a lot of these teams behind it, but Illinois Orange did lose to Rutgers. It gets sort of messy. So Penn State has their win over Rutgers, Hawaii Manoa, OU Crimson. Again, this looks like about the right place to them. Then we get on to... Then we'll go ahead and move on to Illinois Orange here, who did beat Akron, a 7-3 team. They're also a number 2 team in... No, they didn't stay number 2 in that. I'm mixing up regions. That's fine. So 7-3 team in homecoming. They also have a win against University of Florida, who's down here, as well as Hawaii Manoa, who we've talked about. They've got losses to Rutgers, who's not on this power ranking anymore, but was previously, who went 6-4, University of Washington, and Lords. So they went front, 7-3, lost to a 6-4 team. That's not great, but then we're going to find that they have lots of wins against some of these other teams too. So they're a weird, a little bit of a anomaly type team. They were actually quite in the middle of a lot of things for calculating how teams were doing. CU Boulder, they beat Ball State, Michigan. Those aren't terribly impressive schools. They lost to Utah. That's perfectly fine. They also lost to Akron. Again, Akron didn't make it. Akron 7-3. That sort of hurts, sort of gets messy. And you're going to find a lot of that in this good teams tier. Becomes very much, hey, who's going to beat who on what given day? How are players feeling? That sort of thing. You get a lot more stability. I say you get a lot more stability up in these higher tiers, but the reality is we just saw Northwood fall to the Comets, and we just saw Bay State fall to Harrisburg. So maybe your stability isn't that great. Okay. Then we're going to put UCLA, and for UCLA, let me pull this up. They've got a win against Riverside, a win against the Longhorns, losses to Bellevue, Utah, and Ohio State. Okay, well, that makes sense. They've got a win against Riverside, like we said. They've got a win against Longhorns, who did just barely miss it if memory serves. Okay, that's going to give us something. They are a 7-3 team. We're going to be putting them ahead of some 8-2 teams, but that's where we're putting them. Riverside, or UC Rolled for those that don't know, they beat GMU. GMU, I believe, won their division in NACE, but they're about a 4-2 team, so that gives us some level of, okay, UC Rolled seems to be able to take out about a 4.2 team. They did, however, lose to UCLA and USU. So let's do a team that didn't make it, lost to UCLA. They're going to be behind UCLA here. They play them again next week. Want to see if they can do it? Okay, George. Nice. Let's see if they can take wins off of Lords. Lots of love for Louis. Okay. Got it. So next we move on to Mizzou, and Mizzou are 8-2. They did beat Ashland over in NACE, which, okay, that helps us know something about them. They did, however, lose to University of Texas Dallas. That's not really telling us much at this level, but they also lost to Illinois Orange, and the loss to Illinois Orange is going to hurt them. Again, Illinois Orange is a 7-3 team, just like, again, Riverside, who I believe I didn't mention was 8-2, lost to UCLA, who is 7-3. So some of the 7-3s have wins against 8-2s, and that's putting these 7-3s ahead of the 8-2s here. So that's ultimately what we're looking at in terms of their wins. Again, that Ashland win, that's something that tells us something of their strength level. Then we get onto the controversial stuff. So we've got the Carnegie Mellon Catgirls right here, and we've got UW Stout. They probably threw their first 2 rounds. They probably threw their first 2 matches in homecoming and then went on to run the table, mostly against easy teams. The reality is neither of these teams beat anyone terribly impressive. UW Stout threw to Longhorn Gaming in the first round, who actually ended up being an okay team, and to Overwash Red, and then went on to go 8-2, picking up wins against teams that just don't mean anything. Carnegie Mellon Catgirls I'm going to put a little bit higher because they did beat UC Davis, who was a 7-3 team, who is a real GM plus level team. It's not telling us much though. They probably threw to New York Ultraviolets in Michigan. New York Ultraviolets in Michigan are sort of above middle of the table, but teams that are recognizable when you're looking through who's beating who's winning against who. Like, they're not terrible teams by any means, but they're not teams that were ever going to make the top 32, even with some good luck. So yeah, these 2 teams probably threw their way here. I am going to put Carnegie Mellon Catgirls a little bit higher here because, hey, at least I know enough about a team that they beat. It's a GM plus team. They did have to beat that, even if it was just like a kind of bad luck that they got a sort of reasonably good team there in one of their last 2 rounds. And for those that don't understand what I'm talking about, it is a Swiss bracket that reseeds every 2 matches. So what happens is it'll absolutely destroy your tiebreakers if your opponents don't then go on to do well. But if you make it to an 8-2 record, your tiebreakers aren't going to matter too much. You're going to make the the group stages, which is not actually the playoffs. It's sort of the first level before the playoffs. Group stages are what come next here. So they maybe did that. Maybe they just had a bad first weekend. Maybe both of these teams just had a bad first weekend. They were missing a player. They were super out of it. Something clicked for them and they got a lot better. That could be what happened. But it looks like they exercised a strategy to make it into group stage, and it paid off for these two. There are other teams that tried something similar or look to have tried something similar. The ones who did that with one loss in the first weekend mostly didn't seem to have done it. The ones who did two losses intentionally, perhaps intentionally, do seem to have gone ahead and made it. Or at least these two did. There may be others that intentionally tried to get two and then, whoops, wait, weren't able to make it through. But these two did make it. Then we've got University of Toronto. This is the blue version for those that were keeping track. There was a blue and a silver, but this is, of course, the better of their two teams. There's not too much to say about these guys. They lost to Bay State, Maryville, and Northeastern, and they went 7-3. They don't have any meaningful wins, so we really can't more accurately place them than this. And then we're going to go ahead and get over to University of Florida, orange, but University of Florida's main team there. And again, we unfortunately don't have too much information. They lost to Illinois Orange, so we know that they should be somewhere behind. Oops. Wrong arrow. We know they lost to Illinois Orange, so they should be somewhere south of them in our rankings, as well as losses to Northwood and Longhorn Gaming. Longhorn Gaming didn't make it, so I feel pretty comfortable pulling these guys somewhat back down here. They're a 7-3 team. They lost to Longhorn, who didn't make it. They lost to Illinois Orange, who's down here. Feel pretty comfortable putting them down in this territory. Yeah. So that's really what we've got for this one. SCAD 3-0 Boise, did that happen? If that happened, I'll move things. Like I can't move things in the middle of this because it causes me to recalculate too much. But what did that happen in? Was that a LAN? Was that I don't think they're not in the same group for, what do you call it, NACE. So I'd love to know where that happened. Obviously, I've listed, I don't know if I linked it in this one, I listed in the previous rankings video who I was putting where and what tournaments I was looking at, and I've since expanded my reach and looked a little bit further, some based on what people have linked me. But if there's other tournaments where important matchups happened, please do let me do. Please do point them out to me. I am going to have to see them there. Great. Okay, that's what we'll go ahead and do for that. That's going to finish these out. If I see any questions there, I can certainly respond to those. But yes, it would not terribly surprise me. Was it on Boise stream? No clue? Okay, well, I'll take a look, but Boise stream, if memory serves, I think that one is sub only, so I don't really think I can go back and check. But if someone can get me what tournament that was or get me records that validate that, I'd definitely be interested. It moves stuff around. It makes things a little bit of a pain because the Santa Cruz did beat, I mean, it's not like pain, like this is what happens. Rankings blow up, and that's always interesting. That doesn't terribly surprise me. SCAD being this low was always a bit of a surprise to me, but they did lose to the Banana Slugs there in Homecoming. So that's why they were here. If they've beat someone ahead of them, that gives me a great reason to move them, and that would certainly be interesting. Okay, if you guys are enjoying this type of collegiate content, please do drop a like, consider subscribing. Do drop comments down below telling me you hugely disagree with my power rankings. I missed this important match, that important match. You're probably not going to be able to link things directly in the comments because YouTube gets unhappy. But if you do want to link a tournament results or something to me that you're like, no, Temporal, you missed this, whatever, absolutely join my Discord in the description below, because in there you will be able to link them and I'll take a look, and it will, of course, make adjustments for future power rankings that come out. SCAD underrated. Could be. Absolutely could be. I mean, I would tell you from Scrim Strength, SCAD underrated here too, but I do this more off of match results. Like, I do this pretty heavily off of match results. And I'd previously placed SCAD reasonably where I did because, again, they had that loss to the Banana Slugs. And again, if we look at Homecoming, they have a 7-3. They have a pretty tough 7-3. I'd say they had the second toughest path through the bracket. The toughest path through the bracket actually, ironically, belongs to Northwood. None of us just thought it was that tough for them because they're Northwood and they won their matches. But I do think SCAD probably had the second toughest route through the bracket. It looked like Northeastern was going to have that before they changed who everyone's opponents were for this last weekend. Before that, it looked like Northeastern, after having previously had to go against these two schools, as well as UNT, as well as Davis, as well as, lots of things, was also going to have to go up against Maryville and Santa Cruz. But ultimately, I think it's safe to say that with the changes, Northwood probably had the hardest, and SCAD probably had the second hardest path through the bracket. Okay. I will see you guys in the next one. Drop a like, consider subscribing if you haven't.